SpaceX bringing 2 NASA astronauts home this weekend from a historic mission if Hurricane Isaias allows for their safe return. Back in May, Robert Behnken and Douglas Hurley became the first astronauts to enter orbit on a commercial spacecraft. They are scheduled to splash down to Earth this Sunday. CNBC space reporter Michael Sheetz is here now with a preview. Michael, what is the return process like for these 2 astronauts?
Well, I want to talk through the mission a little bit here first, because it's very important to remember in context that the name of the mission, Demo 2, indicates that this is a demonstration. Look, this is a flight test, and the first time that SpaceX has ever sent astronauts to the International Space Station and now is returning them. So all of this is a first-time test with astronauts on board these spacecraft. So that's all very important to keep in mind. It originally also was supposed to only last for about a week, and they extended the mission to about 2 months so that the astronauts were able to perform more scientific experiments on board the space station. They were able to do spacewalks, to do repairs outside the ISS, as well as test out the Crew Dragon spacecraft themselves with habitability tests to make sure it's comfortable and that all the systems and different processes work well. The important thing to remember as they're coming back down is that this spacecraft needs to be able to survive the intense pressure and heat of reentry, and then its parachutes deploy to safely and gently bring them back down for a splashdown in the ocean.
So let's talk about that return. What are the concerns around Hurricane Isaias? If they can't get back this weekend because of the storm, do we know when they'll be able to try again?
Well, NASA and SpaceX are very closely monitoring Hurricane Isaias, and due to the storm, they're likely to aim for either Pensacola or Panama City, 2 of those 7 possible different splashdown locations that the organizations have identified as possible recovery zones. SpaceX's recovery ships, their Central SpaceX Navy, are already on their way, it appears, out to Pensacola and the Panama City area, and this final piece of the puzzle in which they'll be returning down to Earth is going to be really closely watched. It'll happen, the undocking scheduled right now to happen on Saturday evening at 7:30 p.m., with the splashdown then going to be planned for about early afternoon on Sunday. If they do decide to delay, they'll push everything back about 48 hours, and they can make that decision as late as 6 hours before they undock with the space station.
Michael, this morning the astronauts talked about coming home. What did they say they are most excited about?
Well, they specifically spoke to how excited they are to just see their families again. Bob Behnken was one of the astronauts I spoke to this morning, and he gave a little bit of the insight into how much he's looking forward to reuniting with his family. Take a listen.
I think for me and probably for Doug as well, I think we're really excited to see our families. You know, my son is 6 years old, and I can tell from the videos that I get and talking to him on the phone that he's changed a lot even in the just a couple of months that we've been up here. And so that's the thing I'm most looking forward to is, of course, seeing my family, my wife, and my son.
I wanted to also add that his wife, Megan MacArthur, is also a NASA astronaut. And while Bob was on the space station, NASA announced that she will be flying the Crew 2 mission, which is scheduled to launch later in spring, probably sitting in the very same seat that Bob has been piloting the current spacecraft. So if I do say so myself, it's a bit of a spacefaring family.
Unbelievable. Well, quite a weekend ahead. Michael, we hope that the weather allows for a safe return. I know they are anxious to get back. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Allison.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.